At 1 minute past midnight on Saturday, a 50% tariff quietly landed on Crown Royal whiskey, Molson beer, goose down jackets, and ice hockey equipment, one of the most symbolically loaded and broadly reaching product lists in the history of modern American trade policy. Not because any of those particular goods are strategically significant to national security in any serious sense, not because hockey sticks pose any kind of economic threat to the United States, but because a trade war that started over autos, alcohol, and dairy has now expanded into more than 500 individual product categories, covering roughly $20 billion of Canadian exports, and somewhere inside the fine print of a 96-year-old law, the country that treats hockey as close to a national religion is now watching its own hockey sticks get taxed at 50% to cross into the country that plays the same sport just as seriously. If you want to understand exactly what is actually inside this tariff list, why it reaches so much further than most headlines suggest, and what it signals about where this fight goes next, hit subscribe now, because this channel breaks these moments down while they are still unfolding. Let's start with how this list actually came together in the first place, because understanding its structure explains why it reaches so much further than the three sectors most mainstream coverage has focused on. On July 20th, 2026, President Trump signed three separate presidential proclamations, each invoking Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. A statute so old and so rarely used that no president had actually imposed a tariff under it since 1949. Each proclamation targeted one headline sector, alcoholic beverages, dairy products, and motor vehicles, and each one came with its own detailed annex listing the specific products covered. Here's the detail almost every early headline missed, and the detail that actually explains why hockey sticks are on this list at all. The annex attached to the alcohol proclamation does not stop at beer, wine, liquor, and cider. It reaches into an entirely separate category covering ice hockey and field hockey equipment, densified wood products, bamboo goods, and basketwork. The annex attached to the motor vehicle proclamation, despite its name, is the broadest of the three, stretching from Chapter 4 through Chapter 97 of the entire American tariff schedule to reach cement, wigs, plywood, furniture, cosmetics, textiles, jewelry, toys, and stationery. None of that shows up if you only read the press release. It only shows up if you actually open the annexes. The full scope, once you actually add it all up across every annex rather than just the headline paragraphs, covers more than 500 distinct product categories worth close to $20 billion, representing roughly 5% of everything the United States imports from Canada in a typical year. That was the original scheduled effective date, August 19th. What actually happened between that original date and today is its own story of whiplash. Less than 2 hours before that midnight deadline, Trump posted on social media that he was pausing the tariffs for 3 additional days, citing a pending trade deal. By Tuesday, he was telling reporters touring construction on the White House grounds that the two countries had, in his words, come to a deal. Then, late Friday night, with barely an hour left before the extended deadline expired, Prime Minister Mark Carney released a statement announcing he was suspending negotiations entirely and recalling Canada's negotiators from Washington, citing what he called unfair, last-minute changes to the American terms. The tariffs took effect at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time on Saturday, August 22nd, exactly as scheduled once that final extension ran out, with U.S. Customs and Border Protection issuing a bulletin to importers, confirming officers would begin enforcing the new rates immediately. Here's your first rehook, because the actual granular list of what got hit reads less like a targeted surgical trade remedy and more like a sweeping inventory of everyday Canadian life itself. Start with dairy, since it was one of the 3 original named categories. The tariff covers milk and cream, whey and milk protein concentrates, lactose, glucose, fructose, blended syrups, sugars, cane molasses, non-alcoholic beer, and, oddly specifically, essential oils of peppermint. Cheese, interestingly, is not on the list, even though Trump himself cited Canadian discrimination against American cheese producers as one of the original justifications for these tariffs back in July, an inconsistency. The Washington Post flagged directly in its own coverage of the final list. Alcohol covers beer, wine, liquor, cider, and other fermented beverages, hitting recognizable brands directly. Crown Royal whiskey and Molson beer, both named specifically in reporting on the rollout, alongside the broader category of Canadian wine that industry groups have warned will be difficult for American retailers to quickly substitute, given how specific certain wine regions and varietals are to Canadian producers. Wood and hockey products cover densified wood blocks, plates, strips, skewers, ice cream sticks, bamboo goods, basketwork, grease-proof paper, and both ice hockey and field hockey equipment specifically. And the motor vehicle annex, the broadest of the 3, reaches cement, plywood, furniture, clothing, wigs, jewelry, toys, stationery, fishing rods, seeds, tulips and orchids, candles, chandeliers, ice skates, and swimming pools. Sit with that list for a second, because the sheer almost bewildering range of it is the actual story here, more than any single individual category on its own. Technology products, including smartphones, cameras, radar equipment, and antennae, are covered. Athletic gear extends well past hockey into golf equipment, gym equipment, and swimming pool supplies. Honey is covered. Tulips and orchids are covered. Goose down jackets are covered, a detail that matters because Canadian outerwear brands built specifically around cold weather insulation now face a 50% premium entering the exact market, the northern United States, where that insulation matters most. This is not a tariff schedule built around a narrow surgical grievance. It is a tariff schedule built to touch as many everyday consumer categories as possible, while technically staying anchored to 3 headline justifications: autos, alcohol, and dairy, that account for only a fraction of what actually shows up once you read past the first paragraph of each proclamation. Quick pause here, because if you're finding value in seeing exactly what's actually inside a tariff list like this, rather than just the headline categories, drop a comment telling me which item on this list surprised you the most: tulips, goose down jackets, or hockey sticks specifically, and subscribe so you catch how Canada's retaliation list compares once it's fully published in the coming weeks. Now here's the detail that explains why this list landed as hard as it did, and why so many Canadian businesses had so little room to prepare even after weeks of warning that this deadline was approaching. Normally, when the United States imposes tariffs on a trading partner, goods that qualify under the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement receive duty-free treatment regardless of what a separate tariff proclamation says, because CUSMA's protections are supposed to sit above exactly this kind of unilateral action. Section 338 does not work that way. USMCA origin does not exempt covered goods from this duty, according to Customs and Border Protection's own implementation guidance issued the day before the tariffs took effect. That single detail is what blindsided importers back in July when these proclamations were first signed, and it remains the detail doing the most economic damage today because it means a Canadian hockey stick manufacturer that spent years qualifying its supply chain for duty-free treatment under the very trade agreement Trump himself negotiated during his first term gets hit with the full 50% anyway, exactly as if that agreement did not exist at all for these specific product lines. That detail connects directly to why certain categories were deliberately left off this list, and the exemptions tell you almost as much about the underlying leverage dynamics as the inclusions do. Energy products, crude oil, natural gas, and electricity are excluded entirely. Potash, the fertilizer input American farmers depend on for the overwhelming majority of their supply, is excluded. Fish and critical minerals are excluded. Goods already covered under separate Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum are excluded from double taxation under this specific proclamation. Every one of those exemptions covers a category where Canada holds genuine structural leverage over the United States, and the kind of dependency that would cause real immediate pain on the American side if it were disrupted. Every one of those exemptions was left untouched. What got hit instead, hockey sticks, wine, wigs, swimming pools, cement, tulips, is precisely the category of goods where American consumers face inconvenience and higher prices, but not the kind of supply chain crisis that would force Washington's own hand the way a potash shortage or an energy disruption might. That asymmetry, real leverage protected, everyday consumer goods exposed, is not an accident of drafting. It reflects exactly where American negotiators believed they could apply pressure without triggering the kind of retaliation that would actually hurt. Here's a rehook worth sitting with, because Canada's own retaliation, once it fully lands in a few weeks, appears to be built on the exact same underlying logic in reverse. In his Friday night statement suspending negotiations, Carney announced Canada would match the American tariffs dollar for dollar. And by Saturday's press conference, he had named the specific sectors in scope: steel, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp, paper, and electronics, with the countermeasures set to take effect on September 8th, the Tuesday after Labor Day, giving both governments a roughly 2.5-week window before Canada's own list becomes fully active. Notice the deliberate mirroring in that list. Washington hit Canadian dairy. Ottawa is now targeting American dairy. Washington hit Canadian steel-adjacent goods through the broader annex. Ottawa is targeting American steel directly. As of this recording, Canada has not yet published the full, granular list of individual products, covered down to the same 8 and 10-digit tariff line detail that defines the American proclamations. But the sector list alone tells you this is a considerably more targeted, mirrored response than the broader retaliatory measures Canada rolled out and later partially walked back earlier in this 18-month trade war. Zoom out for a second here, because the specific mention of hockey equipment inside this list has become, understandably, the single detail capturing the most public attention on both sides of the border, and it is worth taking a moment to understand exactly why that particular item resonated so strongly. Hockey occupies a cultural position in Canada that has no real equivalent in American consumer goods. The kind of product category that shows up in political speeches and national identity discussions rather than just trade statistics. When American commentators and Canadian officials alike zeroed in on hockey sticks as the single most quoted example from this entire 500-line list, it was not because hockey equipment represents a meaningful share of the $20 billion covered, it almost certainly does not, but because it captures something the broader statistics cannot. An American administration reaching so far past its own stated justification, discriminatory Canadian practices in autos, alcohol, and dairy specifically, that it ended up taxing the sporting goods most associated with Canadian national identity as a kind of incidental casualty of how broadly Section 338's annexes were drafted in the first place. Zoom back in, though, because behind the symbolism sits a genuinely difficult, very concrete economic reality for the specific businesses caught inside these 500 product lines right now. Canadian companies with heavy exposure to American retail have spent this entire summer trying to plan around a deadline that kept moving, extending once, appearing resolved, then collapsing entirely within the span of a single week. Businesses in British Columbia specifically described the looming tariffs as an existential threat in coverage running throughout August, with some Canadian exporters warning publicly that the new duties could cut their American sales in half. American business owners, sourcing from Canadian suppliers, meanwhile, faced a genuinely uncomfortable choice of their own throughout this same period. Several telling reporters they did not want to abandon Canadian supply relationships built over years, but acknowledged 50% tariffs might leave them no real alternative. That tension, Canadian exporters unable to quickly redirect specialized products like wine or hockey equipment toward other markets, American importers unwilling to abandon established supply chains, but unable to absorb the cost increase indefinitely, is exactly the kind of economic friction this specific list generates on both sides of the border simultaneously, regardless of which government ultimately wins the broader negotiating standoff. There's also a legal dimension running underneath this entire product list that deserves its own careful moment of attention, because it shapes how durable this specific tariff schedule is actually likely to prove over time. Section 338 predates the World Trade Organization and virtually every post-war trade institution, and legal scholars have argued for years that it was effectively superseded by the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 and the Trade Act of 1974. That argument carries genuine weight given what happened back in February of 2026 when the U.S. Supreme Court struck down an entirely separate set of Trump tariffs imposed under emergency economic powers, ruling that broad unilateral presidential tariff authority requires explicit congressional backing to survive judicial review. Multiple trade law firms have said for weeks that they expect a nearly identical legal challenge against Section 338, now that it has moved from threat to actual enforcement, and Canada has already signaled it will pursue parallel cases through the World Trade Organization and through CUSMA's own dispute mechanism, a venue where Canada has previously won binding findings against the United States. None of that resolves anything for the importer trying to clear a shipment of hockey sticks through customs this week, since Customs and Border Protection's implementation guidance is now active and enforceable, regardless of any future court challenge. But it means this specific 500-line list may not be the final word on what actually gets taxed a year from now. There's a genuinely strange historical echo sitting inside all of this, too, one that trade economists on both sides of the border have started pointing to directly and repeatedly in recent commentary. Section 338 lives inside the same 1930 legislation as the infamous Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, one of the most notorious economic missteps in American history, a law that raised tariffs on more than 20,000 imported goods and helped collapse global trade by roughly 65% between 1929 and 1934, as country after country retaliated in kind. Nobody is claiming today's $20 billion tariff list on Canadian wine and hockey sticks constitutes a repeat of that scale of economic damage. The two economies and the two tariff schedules are simply not comparable in size. But the structural warning sits right there in the legal text Washington chose to revive after 96 years of leaving it untouched. A law built to broadly punish a trading partner across hundreds of product categories, justified by a narrow set of grievances, but drafted wide enough to catch goods that have nothing meaningfully to do with those grievances at all, tulips and swimming pools included. That breadth is precisely what makes the American reaction to this list worth watching just as closely as the Canadian one, because it is not only Canadian exporters absorbing the cost. Every one of these 500 product categories represents an American importer, retailer, or manufacturer somewhere in the supply chain who now has to decide whether to eat the 50% increase, pass it on to consumers, or scramble for an alternative supplier that may not exist for genuinely Canadian-specific goods like maple products, certain wine varietals, or hockey equipment manufactured by companies with decades of specialized production history concentrated north of the border. The Business Roundtable, representing chief executives across major American corporations, issued a statement over the weekend acknowledging the administration's stated goal of addressing barriers facing American exporters, while warning explicitly that new tariffs and retaliation risk raising costs for American businesses and families, disrupting vital supply chains, and straining what the statement called the important economic relationship between the two countries. That is not a Canadian trade official making that argument. That is an organization representing some of the largest companies in the United States, warning its own government about the downstream cost of a list that reaches this far into ordinary consumer goods. So here is the actual full picture sitting in front of both countries as this specific tariff list takes hold across every affected industry simultaneously. On the American side, $20 billion of Canadian goods, spanning autos, alcohol, dairy, and the hundreds of secondary categories buried inside each proclamation's annex, now carry a 50% premium, with no USMCA exemption available regardless of origin. On the Canadian side, a retaliation list targeting American steel, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp, paper, and electronics is set to activate on September 8th, built with the same sector-mirrored logic Washington used against Canada, protecting the goods, where each side holds genuine structural leverage while exposing everyday consumer categories to direct cost increases on both sides of the border simultaneously. Neither government has published a full accounting of exactly how this list will reshape prices at the register, but the pattern from every previous round of this 18-month trade war suggests the answer arrives gradually in higher shelf prices for Canadian wine and whiskey, in costlier hockey equipment heading into a new season, and in Canadian businesses quietly redirecting inventory toward markets outside the tariff's reach, wherever that redirection is actually possible. There's a broader financial backdrop worth sitting with here too, because the economic damage from this specific tariff list does not begin and end at the border. It ripples through months of business planning that had already been thrown into chaos by how many times this deadline moved before finally landing. Canadian manufacturing has posted sharp year-over-year declines across autos, wood products, and metals throughout this entire 18-month dispute, and tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs have disappeared over the past year, concentrated heavily in sectors that overlap directly with several categories on this specific list: furniture, wood products, and textiles among them. The Bank of Canada has projected the country's GDP will finish 2026 measurably below its pre-tariff trajectory, with a meaningful share of that shortfall coming from permanently reduced potential output rather than a temporary dip that reverses once a deal eventually gets signed. Those numbers matter enormously here because this specific list, unlike some of the narrower tariff actions earlier in this dispute, touches an unusually wide cross-section of Canadian small and mid-sized manufacturers, rather than concentrating damage inside a handful of large, well-capitalized industries like autos or steel that at least have scale and lobbying power working in their favor. Consider what this list actually means, in very practical terms, for a mid-sized Canadian wine producer specifically, since the industry has been named directly and repeatedly in coverage of this weekend's rollout. Unlike autos or steel, where American buyers can often substitute Mexican, Japanese, or domestic alternatives without consumers noticing much difference, Canadian wine regions, the Okanagan Valley in British Columbia and Niagara in Ontario chief among them, produce specific varietals tied to specific growing conditions that cannot simply be replicated by shifting an order to a different country. That is precisely why industry analysts have flagged wine and spirits as among the categories most likely to see sustained price increases reach American consumers directly, rather than being absorbed quietly somewhere upstream in the supply chain the way a more easily substituted product might be. The same logic applies to specialized hockey equipment manufacturers, several of which are headquartered in Canada with decades of accumulated manufacturing expertise that does not exist at the same scale anywhere else in North America. Meaning American retailers stocking hockey sticks and skates ahead of the coming season face a genuinely difficult choice between absorbing a 50% cost increase or scrambling to source from alternative manufacturers who may not be able to match the quality or volume Canadian producers have supplied for generations. That inability to quickly substitute specialized Canadian goods is exactly why this list, despite covering such a broad range of seemingly minor consumer categories, has generated the kind of genuine business anxiety usually reserved for much larger, more concentrated tariff actions targeting a single major industry. Businesses across British Columbia specifically described the looming tariffs throughout August as representing an existential threat to their operations, language that might sound dramatic applied to swimming pools or tulip exports, until you consider how many small, specialized Canadian producers built entire business models around duty-free access to the American market under CUSMA. Access this specific Section 338 list now strips away regardless of how compliant those businesses were with the underlying trade agreement. Waterloo Region manufacturers, Ontario furniture makers, and British Columbia wine producers all appeared in coverage throughout the weeks leading up to this deadline, describing the same basic dilemma, watching a deadline that kept moving, unable to make firm decisions about inventory, pricing, or hiring until they knew whether the tariffs would actually take effect. Then watching that uncertainty resolve in the worst possible direction within the span of a single weekend. There's also a genuinely important detail buried inside how this list interacts with the broader legal framework governing North American trade. One that explains why Canadian officials have been so insistent about pursuing a legal challenge alongside their retaliatory tariffs rather than relying on retaliation alone. Section 338's most unusual feature, compared to nearly every other tariff authority available to an American president, is that it requires no formal investigation, no national security determination, and no congressional approval before taking effect, just a presidential proclamation and a countdown clock. Section 301 of the Trade Act requires a lengthy USTR investigation process that typically takes months. Section 232 requires an official national security finding subject to its own layer of review. Section 338 requires neither, which is precisely why the White House reached for a statute that had sat completely dormant for 96 years once the Supreme Court struck down its broader emergency tariff authority back in February. That procedural shortcut is what allowed this entire 500-line product list to move from a signed proclamation in July to actual enforcement in barely a month, a timeline that would have been essentially impossible under any of the more commonly used tariff statutes available to a modern American president. That speed is also exactly what Canadian trade lawyers are now targeting as the weakest point in the entire proclamation, because a legal authority this unusual, revived after nearly a century of disuse specifically to avoid the procedural safeguards built into more modern trade statutes, is considerably more vulnerable to a direct constitutional challenge than a tariff imposed through the ordinary Section 301 or Section 232 process would be. Multiple trade law firms have pointed out that the same core argument that sank Trump's emergency powers tariffs in February, that broad unilateral presidential tariff authority requires explicit congressional backing to survive judicial review, applies with at least as much force to a statute that predates the World Trade Organization, predates the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and predates nearly every modern piece of trade legislation governing how the United States is supposed to handle exactly this kind of dispute with a treaty partner like Canada. If that challenge eventually succeeds, this entire $20 billion list, hockey sticks, tulips, swimming pools, and all, could theoretically be struck down the same way the earlier emergency tariffs were, though trade lawyers on both sides caution that outcome, if it comes at all, is realistically still many months away. None of that legal uncertainty changes the immediate reality facing businesses and consumers on both sides of the border right now, though, and that immediate reality is worth spelling out plainly. For American consumers, the most visible effects are likely to show up first in categories where Canadian goods occupy a genuinely distinctive market position: premium whiskey and wine brands, specialized winter outerwear built around goose-down insulation, and hockey equipment heading into a new season that traditionally sees a surge in retail demand through the fall months. For Canadian producers, in exactly those categories, the challenge runs in the opposite direction, watching demand from their largest single export market potentially soften overnight, as American retailers either raise prices, cut order volumes, or both, while alternative markets capable of absorbing that lost volume at comparable prices simply do not exist at the scale needed to fully offset a hit to the American relationship this significant. That mismatch, immediate cost pressure landing on real businesses and real communities on both sides of the border, sits underneath every headline about tariff percentages and legal statutes. And it is ultimately the actual human cost this specific $20 billion list represents. Consider, too, what this list signals about the broader trajectory of the Canada-U.S. trade relationship heading into the considerably larger CUSMA renegotiation, still sitting ahead of both governments in parallel with everything discussed here. The formal review of the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement began on July 1st, 2026, when Washington declined to simply extend the deal in its current form, opening an uncertain renegotiation window that analysts have warned could stretch for years without a clear resolution point. A tariff proclamation this broad, reaching into categories as far removed from the original stated grievances as tulips and swimming pools, and doing so specifically by exploiting a legal authority that bypasses CUSMA's own protections entirely, sends a considerably harsher signal into that upcoming negotiation than a narrower, more surgically targeted tariff action would have. Every Canadian negotiator preparing for that much larger fight over CUSMA's actual terms is now working from direct, recent evidence of exactly how far Washington is willing to stretch a legal justification, when it wants to apply broad economic pressure, a lesson that is likely to shape how skeptically Ottawa approaches any future American assurance that a new agreement's protections will actually hold once signed. There is one more angle worth covering before this comes to a close, because it explains why so many ordinary Canadians reacted to this specific list with a kind of pointed, almost personal frustration that broader tariff percentages rarely generate. This is not the first time American liquor has been at the center of this trade war, only this time the direction has reversed. Back in early 2025, when this dispute was still in its opening rounds, Ontario pulled American alcohol from its provincial liquor stores entirely, with then Premier Doug Ford framing it explicitly as retaliation, telling reporters at the time that Canada was going after American bourbon specifically. That single provincial decision spread to nearly every other province within weeks, becoming one of the most visible, most widely supported retaliatory measures of this entire 18-month conflict, precisely because ordinary Canadians could see it and participate in it every time they walked into a government liquor store. Now, roughly a year and a half later, it is Canadian wine and Canadian whiskey facing the same kind of consumer-visible tariff treatment on the other side of the border, a symmetry that has not been lost on Canadian commentators, pointing out that the same category of good that opened this trade war's most visible retaliatory chapter is now the category closing out its latest and most expansive round of American tariffs. That symmetry extends to how both governments have chosen to communicate this list to their own populations, and the contrast is instructive. American officials have largely framed this list in narrow technical terms, emphasizing the three headline categories, autos, alcohol, and dairy, while letting the broader 500-line annex speak for itself through official customs and border protection guidance documents that most consumers will never actually read. Canadian officials, by contrast, have leaned directly into the specific, recognizable items on the list, hockey sticks above all, precisely because naming something as culturally resonant as hockey equipment does more to mobilize public attention and political pressure than reciting an aggregate dollar figure ever could. Whether that communication strategy meaningfully shapes how this dispute resolves is impossible to say with certainty, but it has already shaped how the story gets told, transforming what could have been a dry customs compliance story into one of the most widely shared trade war headlines of the entire summer, precisely because everyone on both sides of the border understands instinctively what it means to tax a hockey stick. What happens over the next 2.5 weeks as Canada's own retaliation list moves from a general sector outline toward the same granular tariff line by tariff line detail that defines the American proclamations will determine just how symmetrical this trade war actually becomes. It will also determine whether either government blinks before September 8th arrives, given how quickly the previous deadline collapsed from a declared deal into a suspended negotiation within the span of 72 hours. If this breakdown helped you understand exactly what is inside this $20 billion tariff list and why it reaches so much further than the headlines about autos, alcohol, and dairy ever suggested, hit subscribe so you don't miss Canada's full retaliation list once it's published. Drop a comment telling me whether you think a tariff list this broad, reaching everything from tulips to hockey sticks, actually serves the stated goal of addressing unfair trade practices, or simply maximizes economic pressure across as many categories as possible, and share this with anyone who still thinks this trade war is only about cars, whiskey, and cheese. Because as of this weekend, it is very clearly about a great deal more than that.